When my daughter was born, I worried and I made plans that I'm going to make sure she has every right, and no man and no economy, no nothing, society's going to drag her down. When my son was born 2 years later, within 5 years, I realized I worry more about my son than my daughter. Empathy comes from perspective, not perception. And we need to teach people that. That gives you balance and that gives you mutual respect. And once we hit that mutual respect as a result of perspective, then we're going to be going places for both sides, men and women. But we have to get there.
Today I'm chatting with Louis Sapi, who's coming to us from Orangeville, Ontario. How are you doing, Louis?
I'm doing very well, Warren. Thank you. Hope you're doing well as well.
Excellent. I am. Thanks. So I thought we'd start maybe with a bit of your personal background before we get into the work you do with CCMF. Do you want to maybe tell the audience about um, where you're coming from, your volunteer work outside of this organization, and um, and your work experience with business as well?
Sure. Well, like it's a broad question. I'm a CPA. I'm a businessman. I have a CPA firm, but I also have a number of business interests and a lot of different investments, interests both in Canada and internationally. Um, I come from humble beginnings. My parents were immigrants. My father was, a, I guess, a refugee from the Hungarian Revolution. 18 years old, throwing Molotov cocktails at Russian tanks, etc. Which unfortunately we see history repeating itself. My mother was from war-torn Italy, and they came to Canada and met here, and next thing you know, we have a family here. So as a result, I grew up with a very strong work ethic, but also was taught to always look out for each other. We're all human beings, right? And to give as much as you can, especially when we were in that situation ourselves, when there were times we could have used a hand and got a little bit of help from people. So as children, so that's kind of where I'm coming from. I've seen a lot, and I want to try to help make the world a little bit better in the little ways I can. So,
Good. And so you said you're a CPA. That's Chartered Professional Accountant.
correct, correct.
And how did you come into this line of work?
On my the giving or the CPA.
I guess just
Oh,
working as a CPA, your professional
that's
work.
CPA. That's a loaded question, Warren. So I was a bit of an artistic kid growing up. I actually had a garage band, and I quickly determined that my capability of playing guitar and my voice would render me into the poverty cycle forevermore. So I decided I better go to university. I was the first, apparently, the very first member of the Shapi family, or my wife's side of the family, to ever go to university. And my wife was painfully my wife, my excuse me, my mother was painfully disappointed. She did not want me to go to university. She wanted me to become a plumber, a good trade. My dad wanted me to become a tool and die maker, a good trade. But I went to university and discovered that if I wanted to have a good degree that allowed me to have flexibility in the world of business, a CPA was going to be probably the top degree I could get, and that's what I did. And as a result, I'm probably 50% businessman, 50% CPA. I have a full service firm, but my mindset is always on M&A and deal making and things of that nature. So,
Well, it's interesting. I think we have somewhat of a similar background. I was very heavily involved in music in high school, playing piano and percussion and other things, but I couldn't decide what to study in university, so I also got a business degree. It was commerce for me, and so far it has served me well. It opens a lot of doors, but yeah, definitely. There's always this tension in each life between kind of the creative, artistic side and the practical, paying the bills side, and it's always a balance that we need to strike. But
well, Warren,
I'm
if I
glad
may
to
say,
see that you've been very successful.
yeah, yeah, but you should keep the music up. I rediscovered it during COVID, I must say, and it's been wonderful. I'm back to writing songs and playing guitar with some buddies, and it's just beautiful. I love it.
Yeah, I love it too. And I have kept it up, by the way. I still play keyboards and guitar quite regularly, so
Very good.
haven't let it go yet. Um, and so, with your business experience, you got involved with a group called the Brampton Angels. Is that right?
True. I'm actually the chairman of the board now of the Brampton Angels. Angel investors are investors that will typically invest in startups. So people who have seed round financing, they can't get loans from a bank, difficult time getting any type of institutional investment. So it's friends, family, and angels. So what we're doing is we're helping not only invest but mentor these startups to help them understand that it's one thing to create a tech product, but it's another thing to commercialize it and take it to market. Two very different disciplines and requirements. So I'm having a good time with it. I'm meeting a lot of fascinating people. So I really am enjoying that. It's another way of giving back a bit because the mentoring is all free and which is fine with me.
And it seems that I've learned in my professional life that one of the best ways to alleviate poverty over the long term is to create businesses and to create jobs for people. Like, of course, the charity work, the volunteering, the social welfare programs, they can help in the short run to with emergency situations. But long term, we need jobs and we need good companies where people can work, right? So um, you've definitely had a lot of experience in this area. Speaking about your community of Orangeville, so you're familiar with kind of the entrepreneurial scene, but you've also noticed a bit of a situation growing with the homeless population. Is that right?
Absolutely. Orangeville is a growing town. It's about an hour's drive north of the Toronto core, and we're about half an hour north of Brampton. It's about 40,000 population now, and it's growing. And with growth comes positive things and some challenges. And one of them is the homeless population is growing here. And in fact, part of the problem is that the homeless problem is growing both in Mississauga and Brampton, and they are being shipped north, if you will, to find possible places for them. And it's become now a real challenge. Like there's a lot of couch surfing. And in fact, I don't know if you ever heard of this, but there's porch surfing where these homeless people, predominantly men, will wait till the lights go out on a porch at a house so that they sneak onto the porch to get out of the weather and sleep. And then they try to get out of that porch before daylight, before anyone else gets up. So you wouldn't be surprised to find a homeless in Orangeville sleeping in residential porches and or vestibules of commercial properties. And it's been growing. Now, thankfully, it's still relatively manageable. In fact, today, I was just meeting with a representative, a pastor from a local church, where I was providing a number of products and things like backpacks full of toques, hats, warmers, hygiene supplies, new winter jackets, new winter boots. So we're going to be helping them, establish at least some warmth. And we're also working together to find housing, temporary housing, emergency housing, transitional housing. They're all very different. It's a very complicated situation, but the solutions would be far simpler if you had all the governments on side, which they're not. When we talk to the provincial governments, they point the fingers to the municipalities. Municipalities point the fingers back to other municipalities and or the provincial government, and then everyone points fingers to the federal government. So at the end of the day, unless you have the political will to find solutions, nothing's going to happen. It's always stopgap emergency solutions, which really doesn't solve anything. So I find it frustrating, rewarding. There's a mixed emotions with dealing with the homeless. Very rewarding when you're dealing with them individually, but very frustrating when you're dealing with the government.
That's right. And there is a lot of kind of finger pointing between the various government bodies at each other as to who's ultimately responsible for it. But it's no secret to any Canadian watching this show that the homeless problem seems to be getting worse all across the country, not only in Ontario, not only here in British Columbia, but just about everywhere. The pandemic and the economic difficulties associated with that have kind of exacerbated the problem pretty much coast to coast. And what do you think would be an appropriate response, like something that's actually going to get to the root causes that we could test out in different communities?
For the homeless problem? Well, first off, education. I mean, the vast majority of the homeless problem is men, frankly. And one of the reasons why they're homeless are there very, very few, painfully few shelters for them. And when I say shelters, I mean real, real shelters, like women's shelters. Women's shelters have, houses and smaller units that provide all sorts of, safe, secure housing. They have all sorts of services that they can provide them, mental health, financial, etc. There are very few of those for men because everyone just thinks men don't need it. So where do the men go? They go into the streets, a lot of these people. And they're terrified, many of them, to go to the actual shelters that are really like stadium type shelters where you just have a bunch of beds in an area. And why are they terrified? Because they figure as soon as they close their eyes and fall asleep, someone's going to steal their stuff, their belongings, and or worse, mug them for whatever they have on them. And or worse, you have mental health issues and people can lose their minds. And if you're in a shelter with 100 beds, there's nowhere to hide. So that's why you have some of these individuals who are determined to stay on the street because that's where they feel safe. You know, Unfortunately, that's where they feel safe. So I've been pushing for, again, emergency solutions, which is tiny houses in Orangeville and tiny shelters with local support for mental health if necessary, and local support for financial services and support. So at the end of the day, the challenge again becomes the municipal level. And in Orangeville, they're having a challenge. You've got some politicians I've met, they just don't care. Not their problem. Push them to the next jurisdiction, right? Others who care, but don't seem to care enough or have that will, that fortitude to actually find solutions, right? And that's the problem we have. So they push it back to the charitable organizations who are overwhelmed as they currently are. And again, we get back to nothing is happening. You're on a treadmill going as fast as you can and going nowhere. So this is what's happening. So the solution is political will, first and foremost. Education, secondly, to help people understand, that largely the largest problem with homeless is it's largely men, and there are reasons for that, which is why CAFE, CCMF, has been so important, and why I support them.
Okay, so let's turn to that topic now because you mentioned to me earlier that you had worked with women's shelters. You've had experience seeing how they operated and the funding that they were getting. Why don't you tell the audience a little bit about the radio show when you first encountered Justin Trottier and CCMF, and what was your reaction to this?
The first time I heard Justin was on a radio broadcast. I believe it was 10:10 a.m. in Toronto, and he was being interviewed about his attempts to start a organization called CAFE, the Canadian Association for Equality, which had numerous objectives, but really it was all about, for lack of a better term, men's rights. And this was the issue, what he was really dealing with. And I'm listening to this gentleman speak and how women's groups were attacking him without even knowing who they were, CAFE were, right? And he came across as a very highly intelligent, compassionate person, not a misogynist. I'm not interested in crazy misogynists. And at the end of the day, I was so impressed that I felt compelled to call the radio station and ask, well, who was this gentleman and how do I contact him? So I ended up getting that information and contacting Justin and saying, Justin, I've spent the last 12 years supporting, women's shelters and women programs, and I'd like to pivot and have a men's program, and I heard you on the radio. Well, we struck up a bit of a conversation which led into a friendship. And he was very challenged. That whole organization simply had no money. They had a lot of volunteers, uh, but no money. And I was just beyond impressed that this person would be putting so much effort and time and intensity into a program that he couldn't even be paid. But this is what he believed. You can't be anything less than inspired by that. So what I did is I started helping him with a little financial aid here and there, and then I did a golf tournament for him, which we started raising money. And over the years, the golf tournament, I'm pretty sure, is accumulated over $350,000, $400,000 for Cafe, which is now CCMF. So at the end of the day, um, that's how I first heard of him. And he was brutally honest, highly intelligent, factual, which I like. As a businessman and an accountant, I like facts. And we all know that facts can be really annoying when they get in the way of a good argument, right? So here's this gentleman, so impressive that I had to reach out to him.
Excellent. Well, yes, it's definitely. I agree that he has a good ability to present an argument with facts and evidence and a lot of good reasons like that. I know that working in this space, that's often not enough to change people's opinions or beliefs about certain topics. Um, it tends to be, unfortunately, in my view, sometimes seen as a little bit of a competition. It's either you support women's issues or you support men's issues. But from our perspective, it's not either or, it's both and. We can support everybody at the same time, and one thing doesn't have to exclude the other. Have you found in your experience working in your community as well as with CCMF, are there any particular strategies that you found that are effective in convincing people to see the cause, basically, to see the need for supporting men?
Well, I guess I'm a big storyteller. So I like to tell stories to people and try to position CCMF as this reasonable resource that is not anti women. And to your point, too many people take a binary approach, on, off, yes, no, for, against. And that's not the situation here. So you have to educate the people of what CCMF represents. And then you back it up with stories of how men have been treated, typically in society. Uh, and that treatment goes right through to the courts, whether it's family courts or what have you. And I have a number of horror stories, a number of horror stories. And what I find is that the majority of people I speak to are men. They immediately want to start supporting CCMF because they had no idea there was some organization like this. And everyone's had an experience with a buddy who's got divorced and just taken to the cleaners, as they say, right? And financially and emotionally abused. And I'm going to use the word raped. I have seen horror stories. So they want to support. But there are some people who just will not hear of it. I mean, I've had a couple of uncomfortable conversations with friends of mine who think that domestic violence is 100% men on women and not women on men. And you have to try to educate them, but that's when you get into the facts and they don't want to hear the facts. They've got this position and they're transacting with that position. So there's nothing you can do with that percentage of the population. So you have to work on the other one. So storytelling. Uh, and then I explained to them, and actually one of the funniest things was a group of women. I was at a function one time. They were all teachers. Now we know teachers. They're typically left of center. God bless. They're compassionate people. And they were all talking about, how men are a challenge and this and that. And I could not sit still and not speak. Now this is a table of 10 people. I'm the one man at this table. And I started explaining to him, do you realize that in North America, it is a society for women and not men any longer? In fact, the world laughs at North America that we've got shifted so far to the feminist side of things that it has become an hindrance in so many ways. And I said, look at the TV shows. And if you don't believe me, look at the TV shows and the cartoons that your children are watching. Whether it's the cartoons or the tween shows or the teen shows or commercials on TV, you have a common underlying theme that our society keeps spreading. Girls are smart, boys are stupid, parents are out of touch. And of the parents, it's the wife that's smart and the husband dumb. It's a continual theme, whether it's The Simpsons, Family Guy, Hannah Montana, you name it, all these old shows, and that's what our kids were raised with. And even today, the commercials, we see it. So I said, you've got a problem. And the way our education system actually has evolved to promote girls and women, which was really needed at one time, but it's gone way overboard now, to a point where now it's benefit of women by taking down men and boys. Our education system is just like that. They don't know how to teach boys anymore. In this hyperactive world, with social media and everything like that, boys learn differently and can't handle teaching boys. I know my kids went to private school. I have a girl and a boy. Private school is ran by a woman, and she was amazing with my daughter. And they had a couple teachers that did not know how to deal with boys. Now, my son was okay, but there were a lot of boys that were not okay there. And I actually had a hard time. You should be a girls' school only. You cannot punish high energy boys to be able to start thinking with any clarity, they have to burn off energy. You can't punish them by taking recess away and having them sit in a corner. You're building the problem, not eliminating the problem of focus and attention. They don't get it. They don't get it. So at the end of the day, you start talking about that. You start talking about the stories of how men have been absolutely abused in the family courts, although I will say it's getting a bit better. Okay? And the abuse in the family court stems from, again, women good, men bad concept and philosophy. Women are good mothers, men can't be decent fathers. If you're going to have to give a child to someone, it's got to be the mom. If someone has to leave the house, it's got to be the father. Why? I advise my clients, if they're having marital issues and the wife demands he leaves, I say, here's your bag, you go if you're not happy. The worst thing you do legally is to leave the house. And then when it comes to custody, which was what CCMF has been helping with a lot of people with advice, it's all about the moms. I've got a friend of mine who almost went personally bankrupt because he had a wife who found the world of drugs. She became a heroin crack addict. Horrible. Abused the kids. He had to fight for 4 years, if it wasn't 4, it was 3 years, to get custody because the courts just were afraid to take it away from the mom, the children away from the mom. He finally won, but it cost him almost every year he had. This is insanity. But that's where our world teaches. Girls are smart, boys are stupid, parents are out of touch, women are better than men. Common theme. So CCMF and led by Justin have been trying to do an educational program as well. They're educating people, and the message is getting out there, slowly but surely. When we first started helping them, you think we can get any type of government funding? As soon as you said you're for men's rights, the door was not just shut, it was slammed on their faces. I went to big corporate clients and peers, and they said to me, Lewis, we'd love to help, but we would never get this passed. If it's a women's situation, great. If it's a men's situation, we can't provide any donation funding. It won't pass the board and the governance standards. So that's the world that Justin was fighting, which makes it all that much more impressive where he's come from and where he's gone to. So this is how I educate people, is really by the storytelling, and I can give you many horror stories, and this way it gets them going. But for the most people I know, they already know many of these stories. They were just looking for an organization that they can support to help.
Yeah, that's right. I think the storytelling is a very important part of the advocacy efforts. And I believe that as you say, a lot of the facts and the evidence, the data, the science is already out there, and it's been known for quite a long time. Like Warren Farrell and other researchers have been collecting this for decades, even going back to the 80s and 90s. It's not new. Like the education gap in public school and in university is not new information. The realities of domestic violence are not new information. It's just that the way that they've been presented to the general public has created an impression that women's, life experience overall is much worse than men's, and therefore society needs to elevate women, and men basically don't need much help because they already have the power and the privilege and these kinds of things. I think the feminist storytelling has been very, very effective, and the men's advocacy storytelling has not been that effective so far. But I agree with you also that it's starting to change. So when I look at social media, YouTube, Reddit, Instagram, these kinds of things, there's a lot of pro male content creators rising up now in the younger generation. Some of them are older people, like in their 50s and 60s, or like Warren Farrell from the previous generation. But a lot of them are, even in their 20s and 30s. It's kind of the up and coming young guys and young women as well. There's a lot of great young women who are advocating on behalf of men. But I wanted to ask you, I think what you're alluding to with your remarks here is the empathy gap. You know, when you look at men as a group versus women as a group, it's clear that in Western countries, at least, there's a lot more empathy for women as a group, and it sometimes is unfortunate that people don't see individual human beings in lost in the mix, right? So I find that if a woman, for example, has a major crisis with her husband or her son or her brother, if that individual is going through a problem with mental health or divorce or suicidality or addiction or something like that, she will often have a lot of sympathy for him because she's related to him. But when it's a man, a stranger that she doesn't know, suddenly the sympathy disappears. And yet on the woman's side, it seems to remain. When women hear in the abstract about some women somewhere else are suffering, or girls, they open their wallets and they open their hearts for this cause. And they don't seem to be doing quite the same for men and boys. At least that's what I've noticed.
Well, I agree, but I come from an immigrant family, as I think I mentioned earlier in the show. And we learned a long time ago, and I did. I'm not going to blame everyone else. I got to look at myself in the mirror too, and how am I handling things? And I think men have to start standing up more for themselves, frankly, whether it's custody or who's being asked to leave a home, or just standing up to wives and standing up to the nonsense that the society and the media is promoting. Challenge it. I challenge it constantly when they talk about, domestic violence. Say, yeah, it's 50-50 roughly if you look at the actual stats, if you look at the actual police reports. So don't continue to espouse all this nonsense where it's only men on women. What about the poor men? I'm not sure if you're familiar, but Ontario, under the NDP government back in the 90s, I believe it was, they created a new police direction to all the police services boards saying, when it comes to domestic violence, when you go to a home on a domestic violence call, if you find the man on the ground bleeding from his head and the woman standing over him with a bat, you arrest the man, get him out of the house. What kind of perverse logic was that? So men have to start standing up and speaking out, just like you were mentioning earlier. There's more and more now on social media, YouTube's, young men in their 30s who are absolutely brilliant, intellectual, challenging a lot of these false assertions, challenging women directly. And it's stunning to see how brilliantly it's working. So that will spread. But we need to start standing up and spreading the word and not being so passive about it. And if someone starts calling me, well, you just don't like women. Are you kidding me? I got a wife I love to death. I got a daughter I want her to have every opportunity in the world. I want fairness and equality for everybody. When my daughter was born, I worried And I made plans that I'm going to make sure she has every right, and no man and no economy, no nothing, society's going to drag her down. When my son was born 2 years later, within 5 years, I realized I worry more about my son than my daughter, based on everything I was learning, based on the shows, the TVs, everything. I'll give you an example. Are you familiar with the three
No.
punch rule in school? No? I don't know if it's a BC thing, but in Ontario, I used to coach a lot of hockey, and the kids were talking about the three punch rule. I go, what the guys are you talking about? These were now 14, 15, 16-year-olds. Well, in school, a girl can punch a guy anywhere in some places where no man should be touched, okay? Up to 3 times before a guy can defend himself. If a guy does something back, he's the one suspended. Again, our schools. The perverse logic of what we've been teaching our society, our young boys and girls. This was a constant. So we need to speak up. I'll stop. And Justin does it in a very diplomatic yet firm way. So I've been trying to do the same, diplomatic yet firm. But I'm not going to take any false narratives at face, and I'm going to challenge people in the false narrative. So I think that the world is changing, but men have to help that change, and we can't wait for other people to do it. We can't wait for the women to allow it. All right, it has to be, and the men has to go out there and do it. You know, Dr. Jordan Peterson's absolutely right. He's brilliant on so many levels. Maybe a little controversial in some, but his basic underlying messaging is right. You have to take care of yourself, you know, first and foremost, and then you can take care of others.
Yeah, I think that's a very good message to take for our audience. And I think I was listening to what you were saying and thinking about Hollywood and Disney and these kinds of industries, like the entertainment and media industries, I think play a very powerful role in shaping our overall perceptions of what the world is like, what men and women are like, what relationships and love and romance are like. And, you know, we've all heard of like, the Disney princesses where I find it interesting how the story always ends right when the relationship begins. It's all about getting to the prince. They don't show what it's actually like to be in a real relationship day by day and do all those mundane tasks. But that's kind of a side point. The main point I had was that I agree, since the 90s, I grew up watching The Lion King and movies like that and things that came after. But the the male characters do seem to be either, you know, becoming evil and violent, or they're ridiculed and idiotic, and there does seem to be kind of a disappearing of the healthy male role model character. And I think that it kind of has a more powerful role in shaping perception than all the facts and the evidence about education and domestic violence and the legal system and all this, because people ultimately what they believe is it doesn't come from evidence, it comes from how they feel and what their identity is. I think that when you change how people resonate emotionally with something, then they will look for the evidence that confirms that belief. Unfortunately, human beings are not always rational, right, as you know. Yeah. So our work is cut out for us in terms of telling a different story, and do it's kind of a marketing challenge more than it is an actual data gathering challenge, right?
I agree. And we have to also start pushing back on this whole concept of toxic masculinity that has that definition is expanded to being almost anything that a man is, right? And we have to push back on that too. I mean, I've had these conversations with people, again, very nice conversations, you know, but you know, the message has to be made that for every toxic masculine man, there's a toxic feminist, you know, that is on the other side. And typically that's what's happening. So to your point, there's got to be some balance and, you know, perspective, not just perception, but perspective. And I've been pushing that concept lately, and I'm sure you're familiar with it. You know, people have the perception because this is what they think they believe from a very narrow lens of what they're choosing to look through, and they will find the facts that support that. Because if you're looking at a wide field of facts and you're only going to focus on these many, it'll support any argument, whether it's here or there, whatever you're focused on. You're going to look at everything. And then perspective, as opposed to perception, is putting yourself in the other person's shoes, understanding their challenges, wishes, desires, aspirations, needs. Now you have empathy. Empathy comes from perspective, not perception. And we need to teach people that. That gives you balance and that gives you mutual respect. And once we hit that mutual respect as a result of perspective, then we're going to be going places for both sides, men and women. But we have to get there.
That's a very good way of putting it. I like that perspective and not perception. It's not always an easy thing to do. What would you say to the women and girls who might be listening to this show about why they should care about the men and boys, not only in their personal lives, the ones they're related to, but just in general in our world? Why should women who have been taught their entire lives that, women are the second sex and women are oppressed and all these kinds of things, why should they listen to advocates like us who are saying, actually, it's time to give some of the attention over to men and boys because they're really struggling?
Warren, that's a tough question. I'd have to think that one through. I think most of the young women I know, they don't perceive themselves as the second sex. They hear that, but they don't perceive it. Um, I'm not sure how to answer that, Warren. I really have to think that one through. I know what I'd say to young boys, but to young women, it would be almost like you need to have a reset. You know, if you want to be respected, you must give respect. If you want to ensure a world which is fair to you, you must ensure that fairness goes both ways. But the messaging they're getting is that they are better than boys. They have more than boys. That they're downtrodden even though they're not no longer. Um, it would be a tough conversation for a man to have with any young woman because they just won't see it yet because they're what they read in the magazines, what they see on TV. But we need to get the message across. If you want fairness, you need to give fairness. If you want respect, you must give respect. You only get out of the world what you were willing to put into it. So, and with young men, you need to now get to a point where you need to demand respect. Take it back. Don't be toxic. Don't be silly about what your expectations are. But you deserve to have a fair world around you as well, and you and only you can take that. It can't be given to you. And for the women, as opposed to demanding and taking, they need to start giving and allowing, whether they like it or not. And I've had this conversation with my daughter and some of her friends at times. It just is what it is. So I'm not sure I answered the question well, Warren. It's a tough one. Uh, Largely because I'm not a woman. I'm not a young lady. I see the perspective that they have, but I'm still not them. And how the quantum of the emotional depth of how they feel things, I can't relate to. I just can only relate to young boys
Well, I
and
think
what
you
we
gave
need
a
to
good
get done.
answer, even if I don't worry too much about whether it's directly answering the question, but I liked it. And
I see.
what was I going to say? I was going to ask you finally about just before we kind of close off this conversation. So you work fundamentally in business and you help with raising money for new enterprises, for entrepreneurs, this kind of thing. I wanted to ask you about men and women in the workplace, both as employees and as entrepreneurs, because I use LinkedIn in my day-to-day work, and I see a lot of messages relating to gender on LinkedIn and on basically on other social platforms too. But that's the one where it fascinates me because I see a lot of things about how female founders get funded a lot less than male founders when they start businesses. I see messages about underrepresentation of women in certain professions, but I never see anything about underrepresentation of men in, for example, nursing or education or the female dominated professions. I don't see that at all. But do you have any feelings about kind of the gender balance within a workplace as well as within entrepreneurs? And is there something that should be done about this?
Okay, well, I can give you some insight, and I will break it into three components. Directly from my world of the CPA world and accounting and professions, legal, accounting, etc. That I can speak about generally about startups, difference between men and women, and then what most companies are looking for when they're hiring, and it from a completely gender neutral perspective. So first off, when I hire, I could care less if you're a man or a woman or whatever you define yourself as. Can you do the job? I look for entrepreneurs, which is an entrepreneur within an organization. They're leaders within a company. I want people who are capable and caring about the company and the clients, right? I've had people with extremely high IQs, which were dumb as bricks, because an IQ is your capability of learning. But if you don't have the desire or you're too arrogant to learn, you're not going to learn. You're not going to be smart. So an IQ, if you're willing, can lead to you being smart. And years of experience and scars will lead to be wise. I want people who want to go through that path. And I could care less if they're men or women. I pay on and I hire on merit, character, and capability. So that's generally speaking how most of my peers would speak like. And I agree 100%. Now, when you talk about women being underrepresented, women are very different than men. Men like things, they focus on things. Women like people, they focus on people. That's why engineering and the physics and the sciences are predominantly uh, 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 men. Whereas nursing, accounting, legal now is becoming predominantly women. I believe there are more women CPAs now than men because they're dealing with people. They like doing that. So they're certainly not underrepresented in the health sciences. They're certainly not underrepresented in accounting, finance, things of that nature. Now, there's a lot of men at the top who've been there for 20, 30 years who've climbed that ladder, and women haven't yet climbed that far. So when they talk about a glass ceiling, that's completely a fallacy. They just haven't got there yet, but they're getting there. You can see it. So that's a false narrative that you hear all the time, false ceiling. So that's from a perspective of my industry, a perspective of what you're hiring. Now, from startups, you'll find that most of the startups I deal with are tech. Again, men like dealing with things. They invent things. They deal with things. So it's predominantly men. And men tend to take far more risks than women, in my experience. So you're not going to find a woman as often in a startup role. You have found them. I've seen some, and they're dynamos. They're amazing. Okay, great. But you just don't see as many of them because that's not how they think. They think of relationships and people as what they like to deal with, and they're not as much of a risk taker. They're very much risk averse. You can't be risk averse with a startup, right? That's very challenging. Now, once you get a startup that's commercialized, and now you're into operation, that's where women can excel. Because when you're into the operation mode, women come in and they're people. They're people persons, that is, right? That's where they get into helping manage the operations. They're logistically minded. They can multitask. And I don't want to sound, that such a difference between men and women in many areas, but I don't want to be stereotypical. But this is just generally speaking where you see women gravitate to versus where men gravitate to. So when they say it's underrepresented, maybe, but it's a biological thing. It's where they want to go, right? It's where they want to go. So, uh, when it comes to the C-suite, yeah, you're seeing more and more women in the C-suite, as because let's face it, women didn't have that opportunity 30 years ago as much. And but with the modern world, once they've gone through their education and university and their articling and their experiences, now they're getting into the C-suites because it's based on merit. And most companies, when they say, "Well, there's an old boys club," that's that's a load of fallacies. I think that's the rare exception when there's an old boys club as a way to one woman. Every company has a single mandate: make as much money for the shareholders, whether it's a private family or it's a public company. And whoever's going to step up to that table who can make you the most money, being the most effective leader, it's gender neutral. Who cares? That's what you want: shareholder value. So that's the bottom line, the way I see it in the world I play in.
Yeah, that's been my experience too. Like when I talk to actual business owners, they care about performance and they care about merit and getting things done. And who does it is much less important to them, right? If you're the person who can get the job done, you're hired or you're promoted, this kind of thing, right? But I see almost every single day on LinkedIn messages about equity and as opposed to equality, which is now you're familiar with this because you watch Jordan Peterson, equality of opportunity versus equity, which is outcomes, right? And I see a lot of these arguments that, oh, because we don't have gender equity in a particular field, that's automatic evidence of discrimination and bias, right? It's misogyny or something like this. But as you just laid out with your elegant words right now, there's many reasons why you might not have equity that have nothing to do with discrimination. People's values, preferences, interests, what they gravitate towards, these kinds of things. If you expect to see equity across all dimensions of human identity in every area of life, you would have to assume that everyone is exactly the same and there's no differences between people, which I think is quite a stretch of the imagination, to say the least, right? Like clearly, individuals are different,
Oh, I
but
would
then there
agree
are
100%.
also broad-based group differences as well. So this shows up in the results, right? So I would support your vision, which is equal opportunity for everybody. You let every single person compete for whatever they want to do in life, but you hold them all to the same standard. You don't judge people by different standards. You say, okay, here's the bar. If you can get over it, you're in, you know? But that kind of like, I feel like even that view is outdated now. It's kind of going back to the 90s. The way I grew up, that was the predominant prevailing view was let's treat everybody the same without regard to their personal identity, and whoever performs best will be the ones to succeed in whatever field. And now it's that I think that is passé. People would say that's no longer, the current way of doing things. So times have changed.
I'm hoping you're wrong, Warren. I know that when I speak to people, it's not passe. It's still the way it's done. They just don't want to say it out loud because of the world of social media and how they can be unbasted quickly by people who have no business unbasting them. So I know that business is business is business. At the end of the day, it's a bottom line thing. And it's funny, when I start interviews, and I just had one this morning, before this podcast, one of the first things I say to the gentleman, this was a gentleman in particular, um, before we start off, you have to understand there's only one role you really have here, and that's to make me money. The day I feel that you're not making me money or making my life as easy as possible, I don't. Now there might be different job duties I'll have you do, whether it's in accounting or admin or something like that to affect that. But at the end of the day, you only have one client, and that's your employer. That's me. And your job is to make me money. Never forget that. So I use that as a filter. If they kind of look at me with, eyes wide open and like a deer caught in a headlight, I know it's not going to be a fit because they don't get it. And so when it comes to men versus women, it's all about the corporate needs when you're hiring. And if they can succeed and they have the merit to do it, God bless them. God bless them. So I honestly believe that's what most people. Now, there's a lot of organizations which have their programs to get equality, and they've got programs to hire more women. Okay, that's their business. I know there was a big push a few years ago for boards, public boards, to have more women representation. It was already starting to happen again as the last 30 years evolved. More women got the experience, right, to get onto boards because you just can't be a token. What woman would want to be a token on a men's board, or what man would want to be a token on a woman's board, right? If that's how is that how little you think of yourself, knock yourself out. So at the end of the day, boards have a fiduciary responsibility to the shareholders, and in some cases they have personal liability. Directors, they got to get the brightest and the best available at that particular moment, gender irrelevant, right? But there were laws now to push more women into boards, and it hasn't been that bad. But there has been circumstances where boards have suffered because they don't have the skill set that they needed.
It's actually a form of disrespect if you think about it, that we hired you because of your gender or your race or something like this, not because of what you can do, not because of your ideas, your creativity, your talent, but because of something that you were born with. We hired you for that, or we promoted you for that. To me, that is like, I would not want to promote that message to anyone, because it's essentializing people and saying that, you know, people from this group, whether it's women or whatever, they have some quality that we need just by virtue of being women. And it doesn't matter which woman is sitting in the chair as long as it's a woman. To me, that is quite disrespectful to women. The fact that you earned it on equal grounds, competing with everybody else, deserves a lot more respect. So I think you and I would see things more or less eye to eye on this point.
Oh, I'd want to be hired based on my capability and merit, not because there's a quota to be filled, and then sit in a corner and be quiet. You know, that's not how I would want.
The other point I wanted to just say when people bring up this topic is the apex fallacy. We often look at Fortune 500 CEOs, we look at boards of directors, we look at heads of government, members of parliament, these kinds of like peak of the pyramid positions, right? And the arguments often go that we don't have 50% of women in this small subsector of the population. But almost nobody is in those positions, right? The number of CEOs and members of parliament as a fraction of the whole population is very, very small. So most men are never getting there either, right? But they never look at the bottom of the pyramid, like who are the ones dying in the workplace? Mostly men. Who are the ones, the homeless population, as you pointed out at the very beginning, mostly men. The ones dying of drug addiction, mostly men. The ones in prison. Jordan Peterson has made all these arguments, right? And I would also say the dirtiest and dangerous jobs, which comes back to the pay gap argument, most of those jobs are also done by men. So I don't hear a lot of talk of equity in the workplace deaths or something like this because it doesn't fit the usual narrative. So there's a lot of things we can say about where our attention goes, and I think if we're going to have attention on, putting women into certain positions, we need to look at the entire labor market, the entire economy, not just the places that are, the privileged, cushy. Maybe cushy is not the right word, but the best places. We can't just look at that. We have to look at everything. So that's kind of a bigger topic, and I don't think we're going to resolve that today, but it's important to mention.
Well, it's well said. Very well said.
Okay, well, Lewis, I think this brings our talk to a close. So I want to thank you for your time. speaking with me. It's been a real pleasure. I learned a lot of things, and it's great to hear your perspective, as you say, learning from other people's perspectives, right? I hope we get a chance to talk again.
Well, I appreciate it, Warren. I enjoyed it. I appreciate it. Thank you very much. Have a great day.
You too. Take care.